My research focuses on the role of public education and issues related to public education, such as school funding, segregation, and school choice. My recent project studied venture philanthropy in public education, interviewing philanthropists, teachers, and public school principals in thinking about the role of competitive grants coming into public schools. It highlighted a significant issue of precarity, public school principals working really hard for competitive funding, also underfunding and lack of fair resourcing. The justice problem that my research looks at is economic inequality, but also social inequality. Unfair funding of public schools leads to multi-layered dimensions of injustice, and this form of injustice creates hurdles, exclusions, and disadvantages, and contributes to a lack of social mobility for particular groups of young people. We need to have a vibrant, robustly funded public school sector, and this is critical for social mobility in that young people should be able to access a wide variety of career paths, irrespective of their background or family wealth. So every young person should be able to access the best football pitch or the best science laboratories, regardless of their family wealth or where they come from. We have a problem in Australia right now in that we are subsidising and funding industries at the expense of our public school system. For example, we are actively subsidising the fossil fuel industry. Government funding of the fossil fuel industry has actually increased, whereas our real funding of public schools is decreasing. And this disinvestment of public education is actually a disinvestment from young people and their futures. There are many steps we can take to improve the funding of our public school system. And I think in order to understand it, we actually have to understand that we have three sources of funding, and that is recurrent funding, capital funding, and private funding. And recurrent funding is our student-based funding, and that is our only needs-based funding. So that is calculated according to the Schooling Resource Standard. It's often called the SRS. And recurrent funding is the only source of funding that is tied to a needs-based measure. While we have a lot of arguments that our funding system is adequate because it is needs-based, this is only linked to one form of funding, and it excludes two other really substantial forms of funding, which is capital and private. Capital funding is for school buildings, libraries, infrastructure, gymnasiums, rugby fields, football pitches, swimming pools, things like that is capital funding. And that is such a significant issue in our school funding system. It really stands out as one of the biggest problems we have. Our capital funding is ad hoc, so it's not tied to any needs-based measure. It is inconsistent, uneven, and this was highlighted a really long time ago in the 2011 Gonski report. So private schools actually receive capital funding from both federal and state government, whereas public schools only receive capital funding from the state. We have recently introduced one-off federal grants for public schools, but this does not get rid of the history of capital funding for public schools being very deficit-based and not being enough. So we really need to fix capital funding. The issue as well is we have private forms of funding from families, and this is incredibly uneven. It is also really, really high in Australia, our private forms of funding. So if we compare our private forms of funding, a typical household in Australia will contribute 21% to secondary school, whereas the norm is only 9%. So we really do stand out as having much higher forms of private funding for secondary schools in particular. And that is not good for equity in that every family has different forms of funding that they can contribute, so it really is uneven and inequitable. So our private forms of funding actually need to be regulated and capped, and they should affect government funding. So if a private school is charging tuition fees that are higher than the cap, it should affect their government funding. So we need to have some kind of regulation around private forms of funding, tied to a needs-based measure as well.